Yeah.
Were in terms of knowing how to pronounce it.
Right. Yeah. My husband likes to give it a sort of like,
Ulibarri.
but yeah, he can roll his R's.
Yeah.
We can get started. Does anybody want a copy of this? A copy that has bios and things in it? No? Everybody have one? Cool. So this panel is plotting without plotting. So I am Michael Rizza. I'm the chair of the Department of Languages and Literature, and I'm also an associate professor of creative writing in American Lit. And this has been a wonderful event. And I thank everybody for coming. And one of the things I like about moderating the panels is that I feel like I learn a lot, and I bring it back into my classroom, and I bring it back into my own writing. So it's great to have everybody here. So I'm not going to read everybody's bios because we all have it, but I will introduce everybody. We have Jeffe Kennedy, Kelly Robson, Melinda Snodgrass,
Just got back. I'm here. Barely in time for
Sarena
attendance.
Ulibarri,
Present.
and Walter Jon Williamsow.
Yo.
So we have a full panel. So I have like a handful of questions. I don't know if I'll get to all of them, but they're all related to like plotting. So my first question is, and if people have questions, you can raise their hands or just join in. It would be a good thing if I don't get to all my questions. Okay? So my first question is, do you begin with plot or elsewhere, such as with character, premise, or a scene? Or another way of putting this is, at what point does plotting come into your writing process?
Well, I guess I usually start with, I see a scene and the character or characters in this moment, and then I wonder how they got there. How did they end up there? And who are they? And what's their axe to grind with reality? And that's where I start. And then the heavy duty work starts of actually plotting the thing, but that's where it begins for me.
I start with the problem. The problem or often the thing that I'm angry about that I want to write a story about.
Yeah, I usually start with a character. Sometimes I start with a world. And I can go into some detail on this world usually. And so I create the story to show the world to the reader in as many places as I can. And if it's a character, then I try to devise ways to put that character under pressure to show the reader what that character is made of. And also trying to keep in mind, if it's a short story, this should be the most important moment in the reader's life, or in the character's life, okay? Because otherwise, why are you writing a short story about it?
Yeah.
Right? If it's a novel, it's the most important piece of time in that character's life.
This is Howard Waldrop.
Yes.
Yes.
I couldn't tell if you were dodging.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right. So like Melinda, I almost always start with character and situation and figuring out how they got there. Unlike Melinda, I don't plot anything beforehand. I'm kind of rabid about distinguishing between pre-plotting versus plotting, because my contention is that we all plot or we don't have a story. The difference is at what point, you asked at what point in the story do we do it. For me, the plot unfolds as I go along. I'm incapable of figuring out what the plot is before I start. So I have character and situation, and then I ride with them and figure out where the story goes.
I usually start with just a premise or an image or just some sort of what if, And if it's a short story, I'll just start writing and just wing it and see where it goes and just try to make sure something's different at the end than it was at the beginning. And then I'll go back and see if it needs a little more, methodical plotting. If it's a longer project, what I outline, and I do sort of plot it out and say, this happened, and here's the rising act, here's this. And then I start writing and realize that the outline that I've made is complete nonsense, and I've written myself into a corner. None of the plot makes any sense. And so I have to go back and sort of re-outline it and figure out what the plot actually is based on what I've written and what the story's turned into since I started to write it. So, but I think plotting is always a revision step. It's never a first draft step for me.
So my next question is, at what point or how do you engage outside expectations when it comes to plot? So I can imagine like editors or agents' expectations or genre expectations or even readers' expectations.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I think it's a question I asked Connie in the last panel and to that panel. I think expectations, I mean, you have to be aware of them, especially like people expect a certain thing from a romance. I mean, that doesn't mean that it has to be absolute formula, but you have to be somewhat aware of what the reader or the viewer, if they sit down to watch, a show or read a book, if it's a mystery novel or crime novel, it's going to have certain steps or certain pieces of it that I think frustrate people if you don't meet some of those expectations. I don't think you have to slavishly meet every one. It doesn't have to be complete formula. I mean, in Hollywood, formula is our friend, because we kind of need it in order to get a television episode on the air. Or a movie to the screen, but and in books I think you have a little more leeway, but I do think there are some expectations from the readers that if you fail to meet any of them, they're not going to be happy with you.
Yeah, I think with most decisions you make, you are making some kind of promise to the reader.
Mm-hmm. Good word.
And the reader would like you to fulfill this promise, but you can always throw in a ringer. You can always have a complete surprise. But if you do that, the modification that you come up with had better be better than what the reader is expecting, right?
Yeah, you can't violate the initial promise that you make to the reader. So that's part of what Melinda's getting at, I think. Like if you promise that this is going to be a romance and you think that, what's going to be really cool is to, have everyone die again or have them in the end or break up at the end, you're not being clever, you're not subverting the trope, you are breaking a promise. But there are ways to communicate early on what those promises are.
Mm-hmm.
I really think this is often a question for the editor more than for the writer. And like when you've written your book and you've turned it in, and then your editor is going to come back and say, well, it needs to be more romance than fantasy, right?
Right.
And that has to
We're just
do
talking about this.
and that has to do more with how they intend to sell it than really what the story is. And so, then there's a line the writer has to walk to not compromise their own vision, just for this. But I really do think that an editor or publisher is going to have a better sense of who they are trying to target this book to. Or if you're self-publishing, then you have to do that work, or you have to hire someone to do that work to figure out who your audience is and what the expectations of that audience is. But again, that's like a later draft tweaking, right? You can't, if you get too concerned with this too early in the process, you're just going to overthink it. You're going to worry too much about, this hypothetical reader when you haven't even written the thing they're going to read.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, it takes time to write a book. It takes me the better part of a year. Currently, I'm working on one that's going over 2 years. And during that time, everything can change. You know, what your editor is looking for can change. What the reader wants to read can change, because the reader can just say, no, I'm sick of that kind of book. I want something new.
But you can't predict that.
No, you can't. But that's something that you have to be aware of. You can possibly, if you see something changing, you can possibly tip your writing in that direction. I've never succeeded in doing it, but yeah, this is one reason why I haven't written that many long series, because every time, until recently, every time I've started a series, all publishing changed by the time I finished it. And so, you know, it went down the tubes, either because the readership wasn't there anymore, or the publisher decided that the readership wasn't there and wouldn't support it. The current one, the Praxis series, is now up to 8 books, and that one seems to have worked out. The original audience seems to have developed around it. So I'm very pleased with that. But at any rate, you know, that everything can change at any time, or we could all be, you know, replaced by AIs.
From a short fiction perspective, as I've only written up to 40,000 words, I'm telling, maybe this is, you know, I'm saying something that everybody knows here, but I'm telling myself the story as I go along. I'm my first reader. I'm the one I'm pleasing. So if the story works for me, then it's a success, as whether it sells or not. I've done if the story works for me, I've accomplished what I need to do.
Yeah, I don't think about, oh, where is this story going to go next? What can I do that would be interesting? It's the characters are living the story for me, and but that's because I come at it from a very intuitive perspective, and so. But for me, writing a story is very similar in some ways as reading a story. That I am finding out what happens. Kelly and I talk quite a lot about stuff, and I will say things like, my characters have themselves in a terrible jam, and I have no idea how they're going to get their way out of it. And it'll be really interesting to find out what they do.
Yeah, so it sounds like several people, like from in the beginning, were saying like begin with character or a problem, or put attention on the character, and somehow the plot seems to arise out of the situation that the character is in. So it's not like scripted. It's like there's a relationship between the motive of the character or the problem of the character, and then where the story goes.
Well, I was a lawyer, and then became a writer, and then I ended up at Hollywood, and we plot. I mean, you can't write for television without plotting very precisely. You don't have time. And also, there's a ton of other people who need to know what sets they have to build and what props they need and costumes. And so you can't just, sort of write and then say, okay, here's the script, here we go. So once I have that idea, I know the opening of this new book series I have in mind, which is an unconscious man bloody and beaten on the road, and a young man with him going, help, help, and here comes these people. But then I haven't actually sat down to plot it yet because I haven't had time. I have to finish another book. But at that point, when I'm ready to plot it, I sit down and I figure out what's the climax of the book, or in this case, what's going to be the climax of the final third book, or the end of this book, where would it be the climax? And then the next thing I figure out is what's the teaser? What's the thing that will make people want to continue to pick up this book, buy it, read it, and keep reading? The thing we do in Hollywood, we plot backwards. We don't plot from the start and go this way. We go from, how do I get to this point? And then we go backwards, because if you know where you're going, it's pretty easy to figure out the steps you need to get there. I know this doesn't work for a lot of people. Jeffe,
Melinda and I fight about this regularly.
George is the same way. But the difference is, I love George with all my heart, but he's got more abortive 200 pages sitting on a computer.
George is a bad example for
where he would say, okay, this is it, and he'll write 200 pages and then go, oh wait, it left me in a swamp. And then he has to roll back to where he was 200 pages ago and try a different direction. I try to find the swamp before I write 200 pages. I try to find the swamp in the outline and say, oh, this is such a cool idea. Oh, shoot, that won't work at all.
Yeah, I have a very detailed plot before I even start the first line.
I do too.
Yeah, and in for instance, in my first Praxis series, the first 3 books, I knew what the final line of the last book was going to be before I wrote the first line of the first book. Mm-hmm. And that line works, let me tell you, because for 3 books I was able to write straight to that line. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that it would have some impact.
And I did that in Imperials, which is 5 books.
Oh.
I knew what the absolute moment at the end of book 5 was, and that's what I wrote toward.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not always so easy to know what comes in between though, because I also often know what the end point is, and but then it's like, okay, here's where we start, question mark, here's where we end, right? And it's that, but it's that question mark in the middle that's really the plot, the rising action, it's the meat of the story, but that's often the hardest part to figure out.
That's where I tend to
Hijinks
struggle with the
ensue.
middle, yeah.
I'll have, I'll generally know the beginning, the end, and a couple of points along the way. And so I'm writing, I think you called that the 3-stage rocket
Yeah,
at
yeah,
one point. Like
right.
it's a known thing, yeah.
Mhm, yeah.
And when I get stuck, when I get into the swamp, and I know where I'm going, but I can't seem to get there, for me, it's never, ever a plot problem. It's always a character problem. That the only way I can get out of that swamp is to think really hard about my character and to revise who that person is and what their situation is. Or sometimes to add another character. And that's how I will get out of the swamp. It's always character that's a problem. It's never what happens next.
I mean, the other thing is I treat my books as if they're a play or a screenplay. I break them into acts. And because I know, I have a sense of what each act is supposed to do. And the other thing we do is you do that end and you do the teaser, and then we put in the end of Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, and then again we plot backwards. And it's sort of like tentpole scenes. It's like big moments that you know are going to get you to that climax at the end of Act 1, at the end of Act 2. But yeah, I mean, there's writing for me is like music. It has rhythm, and plotting has rhythm too.
You're thinking about beats.
Yeah, I guess in a way I am. It's that.
And I think I'm the same, that I know when my beats are happening, I just don't always know what they'll be.
Oh, see, and I figure out before, but I want those beats. It's like,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah, I think that's one of the ways to keep the plodding from happening. Is to recognize that at certain points you're going to have to introduce something big and important in order to keep the reader interested. I teach with Nancy Kress at the Taos Toolbox Workshop, and she has the swimming pool theory of plotting. Actually, she doesn't plot, but the swimming pool theory of fiction, where if you're in a swimming race, you come to the end of the pool and you do your somersault and you kick off, and you can swim underwater without stroking, without actually doing any swimming, because you've got some momentum. And so her theory is that if you have momentum, that's short, you can introduce the momentum, and then you can do, like, I don't want to call them the boring bits, but that's what they are.
Right,
You can do
glide
exposition, you can, have some lumpish stuff, you can explain the world a little more or something, yeah. And your reader won't get bored because they know that this,
there'll be another flip.
that there's going to be another flip at the end, yeah. So I use, I have what I call the writer's 3 R's. And this is a development of a talk that I heard Connie Willis give at the very first Taos Toolbox, where Kelly was in the audience. But what the what the R's are the reveals, reversals, and raising the stakes. I'm sorry, I couldn't read my own handwriting. That was where it is. And reveals are just where something startling is revealed, okay? Your character can find it out. Your character can have this dropped on him or her. It's just the phrase comes from plays from the stage, where a curtain will rise and there will be something, some kind of revelation behind the curtain, and that is sort of the meat of the plot, is reveals. You really need to have reveals in your story, otherwise there's almost no story. Something unexpected has to happen. Something unexpected has to be discovered. Reversals, there are a couple things that reversals can do. You can have a reversal of fortune, in which a character just has a huge run of bad or good luck suddenly and unexpectedly. Or you can have a reversal of character. And a good example of that is the first Star Wars movie, just before the battle for the Death Star. Han Solo is leaving. Okay, he's taking off. He says, "Yeah, I'm sorry, this isn't my fight. I'm going to go live my life." Blah blah blah. The next time you see him, he's saving Luke in the battle, right, and blowing Darth Vader out of the way. And that is a reversal of character. You didn't expect him to do that, but still you sort of did, because there were enough hints earlier in the story to show that he was really a good guy. Okay, so that's the other thing. Raising the stakes is just things get worse.
Things get worse.
Things get worse. Things get bad. Horrible things happen to your hero, and the hero, being heroic, sort of plods on if it's that sort of story. So, okay, I've talked enough.
This was touched on a little bit, but how do you keep the plot moving forward? More particularly, can you explain how certain techniques such as exposition, backstory, dialogue, or foreshadowing relate to the forward motion of the plot?
Okay, I'll go on my rant. I hate backstory. If your backstory is really interesting, then it should be your story. It's not your backstory. I mean, I feel like it bogs things down horribly. And it's never good, especially in film, it's never good. And I don't think it's wonderful in a book either. I think, I don't mind, if you roll back in time, you open up and, 48 hours before, that you can get away with. But if you're suddenly having people have these long conversations or these long thoughts about what they were doing 10 years ago or what happened to them, or there was this enormously important thing that set them on the course they're on, if it's that important, you ought to tell that story. And not, don't bore me with this. Tell me the story that you set up and you promised me that you were going to tell me. So that's one of my pet peeves. I really dislike backstory, and I tend not to use it as much as possible.
A lot of what you're talking about, backstory and exposition and so on, don't provide forward momentum.
Right.
You've got that's just a piece of information that you're giving to the reader, and you have to stop the story in order to do it. So that's why you want a good strong kick off the side of that pool before you do any of these scenes at all.
But characters, a fully realized character has a fully realized life. Mm-hmm. And they're the stakes that they are battling against, the things that are important to them, the achievements that they are achieving, and the changes that they are going to have wrought upon them by the plot are all part of why we read stories. Mm-hmm. So these are important elements. I mean, I absolutely agree that you shouldn't bore people, but characterization requires that a character has a past.
Yeah.
Yeah, but spending a ton of time exploring something that happened in the past. I mean, I think you can touch on it and it can certainly define their behavior.
I think if you can make a separate story out of it, and I've done that,
Then,
with through Sula in the first Praxis book, her backstory.
Oh, she's
It was
brilliant.
Really, oh, well, thank you.
That's great.
But I essentially, it's a separate story, and in fact, reassembled all those parts and I've sold it as a separate story. So it is a story in itself, and that's a little different from sort of the incomplete idea of a backstory that you could have. You generally you only need to hint at the character's past. Let's see, I'm thinking, okay, The Thin Man by Dashiell Hammett. The detective has had an affair with one of the suspects in the past, and that informs the story, and it just sort of tells you off right at the beginning that they have had this past relationship, and so you're looking at this character through that lens, and it becomes interesting. It becomes part of the mystery, and that was only done in a few lines.
Yeah, I think that's something that I often do to create forward momentum and to address Melinda's backstory issue.
Mm-hmm.
I like to have like something that happened in the past that is driving the current story that I allude to in little bits and pieces, flashes of memories, like not like that thing that happened before, so that like throughout the whole book, you're wondering, well, what the hell happened? And that you have a reveal at the end. I like to have secrets and revelations of those things.
And I'm reading a book now. It's a thriller, and it mentions the main character, Joe. Let's call him Joe. That Joe's mother was an alcoholic and his father was a violent psychopath. And his father killed himself before Joe could do it. Okay, and that tells you a lot in 2 sentences about that character and where he's from and who he is.
I think I have a little different opinion. Just I'm struggling to think of any specific examples, but just as a reader or viewer, I've encountered several of these scenes in TV shows and books where it's just 2 characters that are having a conversation about the past, and it's a way of delivering backstory and exposition through dialogue. And I really tend to like these scenes. They seem like the kind of scenes that Melinda would just be like, no. But I think that they can work really well when it's when they're really emotionally resonant. But they're not scenes that move the plot forward.
But they're explicating character.
They are, and they're not moving forward, but they're going deeper.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that they can work well when they have that emotional resonance and when they're placed in the plot in a time when we need that downtime, right? When like it's not going to be boring because it's like this is our rest time.
Yeah, and you also have to make the character interesting to the reader before you supply the information.
Sure. The viewer or reader has to care.
I mean, that's why I say it's like music. I mean, you can't have everything. You can't be fortissimo.
Right.
You have to have piano moments too, and quiet moments. But I mean, I'm working with a young man who's writing his first script, and there was just pages of pointless dialogue, and I had to.
That's why you're so fired up about this today.
I am really. and I said to him in a Zoom meeting, I said, look, dialogue has to do it has 3 things it can do. It has to move the plot forward, explicate character, or land a joke. And if it isn't doing one of those 3 things, lose it. Because that's, and I kind of do that in my books too. I mean, my books are very dialogue heavy because I love it. But you can put a lot out there in how people communicate with each other without pausing for description or they're thinking about things or internal dialogue to me slows everything down horribly. I would rather, if I can play the scene dramatically, I'd rather do that than have it be internal dialogue. So.
I'm thinking of something else that moves the story along is exploiting tropes. Because when you use a trope in a story, you create an expectation. Again, it's a promise. So like if you know that it is, say, enemies to lovers, there is that you could do enemies for a while, and your reader knows that 2 lovers is coming. It's like, when is the 2 lovers part coming?
Right.
Or, like second chance, or, if you use like hero's journey or something like that, there's that anticipation that we are going to hit that next point.
Because the reader already kind of knows the plot, and it's the details and the
Right.
characters that are walking that plot that they care about.
Yeah, the changes that you're ringing on the trope
Right.
that people love, that people keep coming back to.
When they're like, oh, wait, is that the muse? Did the muse just, or the mentor, did the mentor just show up?
Well, several people, like, I was kind of interested in this idea that several people have already articulated in terms of rhythm or gliding or beats, like slowing down the pace and stuff like that. So how do you get into the sense where, is it like intuitive, where you're reading or writing that, to keep the flow? How do you keep the flow? How do you know when to slow down, when to speed up? Like, how do you keep the reader, like, because when you slow down, it must have an effect of anticipation, something else is going to happen, or
You don't worry about it in the first draft.
you don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Do not edit the first draft, just write it. But then the question is, how do you recognize it when it's not working in revision? How do you revise?
I revise as I go.
Do you?
Yeah, I've never been able to sit down and just blaze through it.
Wow, okay.
I reread everything I did the day before. I reread it to put myself back there
Wow.
and have that
okay.
and I fix it because there's gonna be problems. I mean, people who like to have first drafts for their archives hate me because I don't really have a, oh my God, this ugly first draft, because
Wow.
I've been rewriting and rewriting.
So you're really
and honing it.
you're really an outlier.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just can't keep blazing through. I mean, that's just not, I have to go back into that moment. That's why I reread the previous day's work before I start the
No,
next day's.
I'm a perfectly insane revisionist. Everything
Yeah.
goes through 5 or 6 drafts before I'm done. And I start just as you do, where by rewriting the previous day's work
Yeah,
and revisiting it. And sometimes I go back beyond that just to
yeah, I do too. I'll
to
go
get
back 3 or 4 chapters
get
and go,
what the
wait,
flow
wait.
is doing. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I track everything on spreadsheets. So I'm on the Leo Virgo cusp, which my friends tell me makes me a meticulous volcano. And so, I'm a completely intuitive writer who does not outline ahead of time, does not pre-plot. I don't know how it ends. But then I have these incredibly meticulous spreadsheets where I track word count in each chapter and pages in each chapter, and I follow the 8-scene 3-act structure. And as I go, I know where I am in the story at any point in time. I've all my percentages set up, and so I am constantly keeping track of the music. I know where I am. First act is when I have all of the stakes set, and so I know when I hit that end of first act, I know I'm at 25%. I know how long the book is going to be. I know when I'm going to hit my midpoint pivot. I know when I'm going to hit the end of the Act 2 climax, and that it's going to be this, all is lost moment, we thought it was going to go great, and now it's a disaster, and then rebuilding from there to the end of the book. So I think I like, even though I am not a musician like Melinda, I like that analogy of the music, because I do always know where in the story, when I'm building up to that climax, and then when I hit that, then I know I have a little bit of breathing room. Maybe that's the glide through under the water, where I know that I have time to start building again to the next thing.
I think music makes a really good metaphor, especially when you consider genre. So, in music, the beats for a metal song are very different than the beats for a jazz song, for example, or the beats for an R&B song, or whatever. Your genre of music determines the expectations and what makes a satisfying piece of music. And it's the same thing in writing, where the genre of the book is sort of going to what kind of book you're writing kind of helps determine where the beats should go. A slow burn romance has very different beats than a crime thriller, right? I mean, there's some overlap, of course, but where the beats go. So I think one of the I think it is a very intuitive thing. Like we just read a lot in the genres that we're writing in,
Yeah.
right? And you read enough, you get to learn. You just intuitive, you internalize what those beats are, and
Yeah.
and know how, and then when you reread it to revise it, if you get bored, your reader's gonna get bored, right? So that can be a point where you need a little bit more forward momentum. You need a different beat there, yeah.
So I was, like several people said, like talking about acts, right? You said 8-scene, 3-act structure, the 25%, this is gonna happen. Like, how do you, I mean, could you elaborate on that? Because it's really fascinating, because like, and other people were mentioning acts and stuff too. Like how do you imagine this structure?
Well, Melinda's the screenwriter, so she can check my work on this. But it's something that works for me since I don't outline ahead of time. But basically, it's Act 1. So you divide evenly into 8 scenes. And so the first 2 scenes or sequences are Act 1, which is the first 25%. That first sequence, you're taking something that's screenwriting and moving it into, for me, a novel. So it's a little bit different. In a movie like that, scene 1 or sequence 1 is, like the establishing shot, and it goes through and, like gives you your characters and your situation and all this kind of thing. So I think of that first, like, and you could say, like, for a 100,000 word novel, my first 12,500 words or so, it doesn't have to be precise, but that's all going to be my establishing information. It's the opening sequence of the book that's starting out the story. Second, and then there's the second scene that leads up to the Act 1 climax, which is when all of the stakes are set, meaning that I feel like you should know what all of the problems are. What's going to happen to these characters? What's going to be the genre? What tropes are we doing? What's the problem? What's the question? The middle section is Act 2 is the middle 50% of the book, and has 4 sequences. And I don't worry too much about those sequences, except that I do pay attention to the rise and fall of action through those. For me, midpoint pivot, I just always have one. It's sort of where everything was going a particular direction, and now suddenly it changes. Go
Reversal.
a reversal,
yeah.
Reversal.
and then up to, so we're talking about same things, just using different language. It's Act 2 climax goes up to 75%, and for me, Act 2 climax is usually this all is lost moment, black moment. It's when we thought things were going, like we were answering the question, we were solving the problem, and then it turns out, no, actually it's much worse than we thought. It was terrible, it's not going to work. And then you go into that final 25% of the book, which is building up, how is it actually going to get solved? How are we going to fix the situation? Like classic story structure, sort of like has for a long time said you'd go up to like 90%, and the final 10% was denouement. And I feel like we just don't really do that anymore. It's like the final section is like maybe 2% or something like that. That Act 3 climax takes place at more like 95 or 97%. So that's my précis on it.
Yeah, I mean, I usually figure that my third or final act is gonna have fewer scenes than the preceding acts.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because it's the run for the credits. We used to call it the run for the credits. After you've had the reversal, everything's terrible. Oh my God, what do we do? We come up with a new plan and we run for the credits, and we run to solve it. And that's usually shorter, quicker, faster. Get there and do it. And I mean, generally, the first act is the longest act because you're introducing a character, setting up the problem, establishing the world. You're going to spend a little more time there than you would. The second act is the result of the plans they made and who they are. And then the third act is how do we fix this? That's, I mean, even though streamers, we don't have act breaks anymore to sell toilet paper, like,
Right.
we used to, although that's coming back now. we still plot in acts. I mean, we still have that in our heads as we work, even if we're writing for, Apple or Hulu or whoever, Netflix. Because it just helps you set the pacing and the rhythm. And we're back to music, but yeah.
I've noticed in a lot of books, the chapters get shorter as you get closer to the end.
Yeah,
And that's part of
that
that
happens to
pacing,
me.
that race for the credits, yeah.
And I'm interested to hear what Kelly says, because I don't feel like you use that kind of structure.
Well, no, because it's different for short fiction, right?
Yeah,
Right, yeah.
so what is it?
Well, a 3,500 word story will be structured a lot different from a 7,000 word story, from a
Right.
10,000 word story to a 20,000 word story, right? Like, each story is its own, attempt at being coherent, I guess I would say. And when I edit, 'cause like Walter, I edit over and over and over and over again. And I do some of the rewriting of the day before, some. But I try not to do it because I end up putting in a lot of pads when I rewrite something too often like
And
that.
I
And then
end
I have
up
to go
cutting.
back and take them out. So when I revise, I'm retelling the story to myself over and over and over again, and tightening the sentences and taking out the flabby stuff and trying to make things stronger and using better, more specific language, and cutting the extraneous stuff. So that's what I'm doing. So
And I think short stories are the hardest thing in the world. So I have enormous admiration for people who could write. I mean, the only way I can manage to write them is pretend like for wild cards, I pretend like they're part of this giant long
Right.
How you guys do it, I stand in awe.
I've been reading short stories since I was a little tiny kid.
Okay.
I have thousands and thousands of hours of short fiction in my head, so it does become very instinctual.
Okay, yes, yeah, I think it's enormously difficult, and I admire people who can do it well.
So
Well,
you
my
don't.
problem with short stories is keeping them short.
Yeah.
I'm a novel.
I start to write a 9,000 word story and 40,000 words later,
Yeah.
here I am.
So Kelly, do you never think about structure?
I certainly do with the novel that I'm currently failing to finish.
But when you write short, you don't.
No. Not true. That's not true. My first published story was very instinctually told out of time. I wrote it I wrote it the way it was ended up being published. I wrote it straight through from start to finish, but it is told time out of sequence. And that was just instinctive. This is how this story needs to be told.
Have y'all heard of Plotter? That program?
I'm sorry?
What's that?
Have you heard of the program Plotter?
Yes.
Have you looked through it?
No. What? Why would I use that,
Because
Amber?
It's exactly. It's so it has like I don't even know 20 or 30 different outline types, and then you can choose, and it breaks it down and it tells you, in this percentage you should be accomplishing this for different genres or different styles or different lengths of book, and then it lays it out, and then if you want to do say like a mystery romance, you can do the romance one and the mystery one and have them separate, and then see like where for both genres things should be falling, and then you can type in your own things. But if you're into formulas, it's pretty interesting because it has so many different, like 20 or 30 different ways to outline. I don't use it, I just read them.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds to me like it might be a useful teaching tool for beginning writers to learn this from.
God, I so disagree.
Okay. I don't feel
I feel like
strongly
I'm
about
an
these.
Like that's the kind of tool that only an expert writer should touch.
Oh.
I agree.
Because you need to learn to do that stuff on your own. To learn to, you have to learn to walk, right? I think. I mean, I don't
know either.
That makes me feel like I have ants crawling on me.
Yeah, frankly, me too.
Oh my
Yeah.
God. And I'm an outliner, but
I'm like running.
there's a balance between formula and something that's that rigid. I mean,
Right.
formula is your friend. in some ways, because it helps define, especially when you're writing for the screen. I mean, I always use house as the example. I mean, you know exactly, there's a teaser where somebody gets sick in a really weird way, and you're gonna have this many scenes in House's office and this many scenes in that very uncomfortable hospital room that has glass in it, so everybody can look at you suffering to die. And, but I agree, I just don't think I think you have to internalize this, and if you're just doing paint by numbers, I just don't think you're gonna get fiction that lives. I think it's going to feel very, very flat, like a piano, like a player piano instead of a symphony. I don't
Or
know.
like a paint by numbers picture.
Or paint by numbers picture, yeah. I just, yeah, don't read Sid Field's screenwriting thing. I gather that Save the Cat is better, but still same problem. It's like, read scripts, read good script, read good books, see how really great writers do it.
Whenever you're writing for screen, do you, like I've seen scripts and there's so much dialogue and a little bit of, setting up and direction, but as the writer, does it start that way, or do you actually write it kind of like a book and then go back?
No, you write it like a script. I mean, you get final draft and you do your thing. And if you're writing with George Martin, he gives me his section. It has a page of stage direction, which I cut down to 2 sentences. Oh, yeah, I mean, and the thing I always tell people is when they write their first script, the producer, the agent, whoever is reading it, they literally do not read the stage directions for the most part. They just read down the center of the page and they just read the dialogue. And if they don't have a sense of the characters, they're not hooked by the story, you're not going to sell them.
And the scripts compared to what you see is so different. That it's like how they get that from just reading the script.
Well, you read the script and watch the movie. I mean, I always say, if you're learning this skill, get the script. They sell them online, or you can get them free online, and then sit and watch the movie and see what changed, what didn't. It will tell you a lot. And remember, it's an enormously collaborative thing. I mean, the director has input, the actors have input. Can we afford to build a set? I mean, there are all kinds of. Talk to me later. I'll tell you about it. But yeah, it's a different world. I mean, novels. That's where I get to really live and play and breathe. Screenplays are very intense. If my manager would always say, if the action or the scene is terribly important, I have to all caps underline and in bold to say, I need you to read these stage directions now, because it's really important.
And I'm going to just jump in and emphasize, because it's really important, that writing a screenplay is a totally different muscle than writing a novel. And Melinda's touching on it, but just like what Kelly's saying, with writing a short story is an entirely different muscle from writing a novel. And you can't conflate how you do each one, because like Kelly talking about, she's written 20-something short stories. Now she's learning how to write a novel, and she has to learn how to do it because it's different. Melinda, writing a screenplay, she's doing something really different than when she was writing a novel.
Yeah, my characters in fiction tend to have really strong internal lives. But were I to turn those books into a screenplay, the internal life is the first thing to go, because you can't show it.
Unless you
On
do
the
a
screen.
voiceover, which almost never works.
Yeah, right.
The day I walked into the classroom.
I mean, I've got to be honest. I was a novelist first, then I went to Hollywood. I think screenwriting made me a better novelist. I think it kept me more focused, and I've always been dialogue heavy, but my books tend to. I move the action through dialogue and not a lot of. I mean, I've never loved description, but I'm always like. In fact, I think it was you, Walter. I was in writers group, and I'd been working on a screenplay, and I went back to this novel, and I turned in my chapter. And Walter said, I had interior bedroom night. And Walter went, excuse me. And I was like, well, the stage direction, they'll figure out what the furniture looks like. It's like, oh.
And it's not learning to write a novel as much as it's learning how you write your novel.
Yes.
Yeah.
right?
Right,
Because
that's a better way to put it.
we're all so different. So you have to figure out your own process and your own.
Right, so like Kelly asks me how I do it, and she thinks about it, and she's like, okay, what can I use and what won't work for me? How am I going to do this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just because you figure out how to write that novel doesn't mean you can apply all the same things to the next novel.
Well,
Right.
I'm looking forward to reading this novel because your short stories are so different from everyone else's.
Thank you.
Yeah. That you've obviously got some internal process there that the rest of us can't access. And it's pretty marvelous. So
Thanks.
I just read Kelly Link's novel. And oh my God, is it awesome.
Well,
But she's got been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize or whatever. She's got a MacArthur Genius Grant, and it's all from short fiction.
Yeah.
Just don't know how much she went through just to get a novel out of her.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. She like
No, I can
wrote
guess.
it for 10 years or
She
something,
just
right?
didn't want to do it.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you know, because that's just not her preferred.
because
medium.
it's hard. It's
Yeah.
hard to do something that's different, yeah.
And actually, I found the novel surprisingly straightforward. It's her short fiction has, elements of mystery and strangeness that they were sort of there in the novel, but that wasn't where that novel was going necessarily. Anyway, okay, enough literary criticism.
Yeah, I think we've like gone off.
Yeah. Maybe it's time for the audience to ask more questions.
I'm curious, Melinda, because I'm like you, that I really like to outline and plan out for script writing. Would you ever consider just do you ever just sit down and just try and write like a scene or a short sequence of things just to see where is it going to go? I mean, I know between the signposts, right? Your temples, you're definitely learning as you go. But have you ever tried that, or because I'm just thinking of how Jeffe, you're you hate the idea of outlining, right?
It's not that I hate it, I can't.
You can't.
I'm just not capable of knowing what the story is before I write it.
And so
I have
are
tried.
you the opposite, where you're incapable of writing without knowing what the story is?
Yeah, I have to know what the story is.
Yeah.
I mean, there are no small children here. When I lecture, for me, it's, I get that idea, I see that person or those people in that situation. And then the very first thing I try to figure out is, what's the theme? What is it I'm trying to say about the human condition? Because the way I've said it is, plot is the shit that happens, and theme is why it matters. And the theme sort of sits there, for me, it sits there like a foundation. It's just under the surface. I don't want it in your face, because then it becomes a polemic, and you're sticking your face through the page and screaming at people. But there's always a theme. There's something there. And then I build the plot on top of that. But I can't build the plot if I don't know what the foundation is, and what I don't know what the structure I have to build. Where are the tent? Walter, I think of them as tentpole scenes. What are the
Yeah.
big moments in each act that I'm building toward? And if I'm writing a novel, if I'm doing a screenplay, every scene is there. If I'm writing a novel, I can't do that. I'd have, 16 whiteboards,
Yeah.
filled with tiny print. But I pick the big moments.
But those
This-
tent poles, or when the rocket stages, or
The
whatever
rocket
metaphor you
stages or
want,
whatever metaphor you want.
that will help you form the novel, because you either write to that next big scene, or you write to the final scene.
Right.
Right? If you aren't doing one or the other, you might consider cutting, unless it's a tour de force, or some serious character moment or something. But
Yeah.
I always give the tour de force exception.
Yeah. But I know I'm not capable of that.
Okay.
I just cannot write an entertaining story that people enjoy reading while they like the characters. I know I'm not
Okay.
going to, it's not going to be the best that Faulkner ever wrote. I don't aspire, I know I can't. I do the best I can. I try to get better on everything I write. I think we all do.
We all do, yeah.
Yeah, how can I make this one?
Well,
better?
not Sarena, but. It would be funny to have someone say, I don't.
Maybe it was John Steinbeck had a novel that had several chapters in it that were called Hoop-de-Doodle.
Hoop-de-doodle.
Hoop-de-doodle, hoop-de-doodle 1, hoop-de-doodle 2, hoop-de-doodle 3. And what they were was just beautiful writing. They didn't advance the story at all. They were just really beautiful writing. But he
Sweet Thursday.
Sweet Thursday, okay.
My favorites.
But he put them in separate chapters so that if you didn't care about the beautiful writing, you could just skip it
This would be
and go on to the next, the
beautiful
chapter after that where the
song.
story continues, right?
The beautiful song that doesn't move the plot of the opera forward.
Yes.
Because at the beginning, Max says that author needs to throw in a little hoop-de-doodle occasionally,
Yeah, right.
and so he did.
Yeah.
Years ago, you wrote for a TV series about, I think she was a deaf attorney.
Not profiler, reasonable doubts,
Yes.
yeah.
So, my first wife loved that show. She watched every episode. I'm sitting there with her. I had read probably the first 2 or 3 novels you wrote recently, so your voice was in my head. And about 2/3 of the way through this one episode, I said, I'll bet Melinda wrote this. And we got to the end and it's written by Melinda Snodgrass. It was just like, your voice was in that show so strong.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I don't know what to say thank you, I mean, because technically that's not supposed to happen. It's just, you're supposed to just be the characters. I mean, that's, you gotta be a minor bird, you have to be able to sound just like them.
See, that happened with me with Jack too, because the first time I tried to read Darker Than You Think, I couldn't get into it. And I traveled with Jack a few times and 2 hours in the car to the airport with him telling me stories about his life, and I picked it up. And I didn't read the story, he told it to me.
Right, oh, that's magic.
Yeah.
So it was,
So you're psychic.
no, I just hear voices.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know, does everybody else, I mean, I hear them talking to me. I'm
If I-
filming a film in my head as I write,
Do you see as well
I
as
did,
hear?
yeah, I take what I've seen and I try to put it on a page, and it's never as good as the picture in my head.
I wish I could see. I can't see it. I can't.
That's strange.
Just as an aside, I've been rewatching Outer Limits, and I've been seeing her name come up a few times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an experience, as we say. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for Sarena. You've been at MFA. How did your approach to change?
Yeah, so I did an MFA in creative writing, and literary is a genre, just like any other genre, and with different expectations, different tropes, and we didn't really learn plot during my MFA so much. Now, I did have some genre writers that were instructors. Stephen Graham Jones, who is an amazing horror writer, was one of my instructors. But the others were mostly in the literary, and yeah, plot was almost a dirty word. It was strange, but it's just they had different expectations. They had different structures that they worked with. And so when I left my MFA and sort of dove into the genre world more, I had to learn a lot of that plot, and I had to learn it by reading a lot more of the types of stories that I wanted to write, and internalizing what those how those plots worked, and analyzing them in the same way that I would have sort of analyzed a story in a lit fic class or in a literary criticism class. I would use some of those same techniques to like break apart, and interrogate the science fiction book I just read, or something like that. So I was able to sort of take some of the tools that I learned in my MFA and do some self-study to learn how to write genre. And it was and there's some unlearning that I had to do with the sort of snobbery of the literary expectations. So that's
Some people say that the hallmark of the literary fiction genre is that there is no plot,
Right.
that it's like the slice of life, or that the character doesn't actually change.
Or the hoop-de-doodle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, it is, because a lot of the literary is more about the style or
Yeah,
about the
it's
form.
about beautiful writing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the character doesn't change at the end. God damn it. Don't make me read something that is that inconsequential. Like, if the character doesn't change,
Yeah.
read it.
And honestly, that's one of the most common critiques that I used to get from when I made that transition, was that my character wasn't changing enough, right? There wasn't something different enough at the end, because I had come
Because you
from
learned
that.
not to do that, yeah.
Because I come through that, but yeah, that's something else I was going to say now.
Oh, sorry.
No, no.
I would, Walter mentioned at the beginning of this, that a short story should be about the most important thing that ever happened to a character.
Right.
Is a touchstone that I use in every single story. I ask myself, is this the most important thing that ever happened to this character? And it keeps me on track, and it corrects me when I go off on the rails.
I was going to say too that I learned to plot partially by stealing. So like my novella here, Steel Tree, is a retelling of the Nutcracker. And so I've done some like other fairy tale retellings where you get to take that plot that's already laid out and just retell it in a totally different way. But the struggle with the Nutcracker is that the first, it's a ballet. The first act of the ballet has a story, has a plot. The second act does not, because the Clara and the Nutcracker are just sitting there watching the performances and watching this like showcase of the different countries and the different candies and such, which works great on stage, does not work on the page, right? And so I was like, I was able to steal the structure of the first act, and then I had to figure out how to actually write a plot for the second act. But I think stealing fairy tale structures or classic literature structures and putting them in a completely different context, then you get those beats and you get those archetypes and familiarity. But then what you do with it is what makes it unique and interesting to the reader.
Someone told me once, we steal we are rich because we steal from the best houses.
What's the legal? Because that's what I'm stealing, but I'm stealing from history, and so like using real people. What's the?
Well, if they're dead, they can't sue you.
They can't sue you, yeah.
Yeah.
If they have like museums in there on and stuff.
Well, so, yeah,
The museum. Oh.
the museum does not have standing to sue you. I think
it can only be an issue if there's some defamation or libel, or if you're writing them in a way that is completely counter to their character. I mean, but then again, there's room for exploration of like different points of view of someone that was a hero. You can write them as a villain, so I don't know.
If you like their personal diary.
well, it's been done. I mean, I've read the diary of Henry VIII, whatever that was, and Cleopatra also wrote a journal. You'll be pleased to know.
Yeah, I think the further back they are in history, the more you can get away with, probably. But
Yeah. But I mean, don't libel anyone who isn't dead.
Always a good point.
And that doesn't mean kill them first, okay? That.
Does the audience have any more questions? I don't know, David, what time are we supposed to be going to?
I think we're done.
Oh, 6:30. I had 2 more questions though. But I guess I'll hold them.
Save it for dinner.
Well, thank you.
All right, thank you all. If you want to talk about your novel sometime, we'll do that.
Couldn't.